Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back to another episode of the Next Man Up podcast. I'm your host, Bannon Crowley. I'm here with my co-host, Colin Martin, today.
How's it going, everybody?
We got a lot to talk about today. We're not going to beat around the bush. As we're recording this, within a few minutes ago of this recording, we just found out that Damian Lillard has been traded to the Bucks. We have a few NFL points to talk about, but as you guys know, we're a big basketball channel overall. It seems like you guys really enjoy those videos. So we got to start with this. Probably the biggest trade that I can remember in recent history. I mean, before there's a lot of those trades that we see, like Ben Simmons and James Harden, where we're expecting it to happen and then it happens and then you're excited. But this is one of those trades that I was fully expecting him to get traded to the Raptors at this point. The talk without the past few days is that he will get traded before the October 2nd when they go out there and do all their press releases and stuff like that. So I was expecting that. And then I see my phone and get a notification that he was traded to the Bucks. And I didn't believe it at first. I go on Twitter and it's the verified account. And this trade just completely came out of left field. I mean, if you told me that Dame and Giannis would team up a few years ago, I would think you're crazy. But with that being said, I mean, we have a lot to unpack here. This trade just happened for us. And I mean, going through this right now, we're basically giving our first thoughts. I haven't really thought that much about this yet. We're going on here having a talk about it right now. So, what are your first reactions to this massive trade?
Yeah, and as you mentioned, in the landscape of NBA trades and NBA news now, there's a lot of stuff that comes out, and we kind of breeze right past it, or it doesn't really ever come to fruition. And it seems like all the rumors that we've been getting the last couple of days have become true, and we never see that happen. Just a couple of days ago, we find out the Suns are willing to move on from Ayton, and they want to bring in Nurkic, and somehow in the Damian Lillard trade, they make that happen. Obviously, three-team trade from, I mean, two of the NBA's final favorites, as well as the Blazers, of course. And there's just a ton of shakeup here. And obviously, based on what we've seen so far, it looks like there's more to come from that. The Blazers, instead of getting a package that revolves around Tyler Hero, they get a package that revolves around DeAndre Ayton. They obviously get picks. And it looks like Drew Holiday is going to be on the move out from the Blazers. At least that's what we expect so far. Seeing Dame go to the Bucks is just something that is unbelievable. I mean, this Bucks team kind of, last year, obviously they were a 1 seed and they fell off to the Heat early in the first round. And it seems like they are following suit out of a lot of the NBA star teams we've seen recently and just adding as many star players as possible. Drew Holiday is a really good point guard, shooting guard, whatever type of guard you use him as. He's one of the best defensive players in the year, and he's been a staple of that Bucks team in their post rebuild era. And they seemed quick to move him on off when Dame was on the board. I mean, this trade is just absolutely nuts. I think we're probably better off going team by team here. So, I mean, I'll ask you first. Obviously, the big contributor of the trade. What do you see the Bucks doing with Dame on their roster?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about all of this is some of these combinations and big two or big three that we were going to see potentially in these trades. I mean, as a Sixers fan, there was always the talk of Embiid and Dame together. But the talk about Giannis and Dame together, I mean, I don't even think this was really in the cards at any point. So that's why I was very surprised to see this. And especially with these two guys on the roster, this is definitely a big tactic by the ownership to get Giannis back. Going into this offseason, as we've seen, that's why I'm so surprised about this trade. I was completely convinced that if the Bucks didn't win a championship this year, then Giannis is gone. We've been talking about that for a while, and it seemed like he was going to leave. But now ownership is fully committing to build around Giannis. And you're at this point with Giannis and Dame that these two guys together in probably any other point in NBA history could win a championship. But now with these rosters getting built up so much, like the Suns, which is also a part of this trade, with guys like KD and Bradley Beal and Devin Booker, there's so many super teams that we're seeing forming together that it seems like a super team isn't even a term anymore. It just seems like these NBA stars are teaming up at this point. And just like this, a huge thing that comes out of left field. And I think the Bucks, obviously, they have the highest odds to win the championship now with everything changing with Giannis and Dame together. But I think we have to pump the brakes a little bit because these championship teams that we've seen, if you're going to tell me that Dame and Giannis are together, I still don't think on paper that's as good as we saw with KD, Kyrie, and James Harden. We saw how that worked out. With all these super teams forming together, you're going to have to give me a few months at least playing together, if not a full year. Giannis is going to have to re-sign. I mean, they're going to give him as much money as they want. The Bucks know that. And this roster is built very well too now. I mean, I would argue that they have the best five-man starting rotation plus a six-man now. And Dame's going to be there for at least, I think it's 2 or 3 more years on the contract. So they're going to have to deal with a lot of money coming in, but I think they're fine with that. But championship aspirations right now, obviously they're high, but I don't think this puts them as the favorite just because we've seen so many super teams go out there and not perform. And these two guys, though, I think the difference between Giannis and Dame is these guys have always been competitors. And going into those Brooklyn teams, there was always questions about Kyrie and James Harden and KD. I have less questions about Dame and Giannis's loyalty to be together. And I'm glad that Dame getting traded now, no one's coming out here and saying that he gave up on the team. I'm glad that we kind of all realize that this is the best time for Dame to move on. But I have to see something from these guys before I go out there and just throw them the championship.
For sure. I want to talk about Portland a little more too, because obviously they were mocked for this Miami trade for a long time because Dame said himself he wanted to go there. And a hypothetical return in that trade would have been Tyler Hero and a couple picks. And, that would have been fine. But I think the Blazers really got back probably the best possible haul they could have got. Drew Holiday, whether you get Drew or you trade him for more assets, it's a very valuable asset to have on your roster. And I think the Blazers are committing to developing DeAndre Ayton with this trade. Obviously, Ayton was a number 1 overall pick back in 2018. The Suns had a lot of faith in him. He got picked before Luka. He got picked before Trae Young. And he kind of has faltered the last couple of years in Phoenix. Now, let's not forget, early in his career, Ayton looked like he was worthy of the number 1 pick. And recently, it just hasn't gone that way. I think it's time for Ayton to prove himself. And in Portland, they are investing into him. I mean, they haven't really had a very dominant center since Bill Walton. The Trailblazers are just not a team that revolve around a big man. And I think now they're going to try to do it. Obviously, if they get a pick in 2029, they get pick swaps in 28 and 30. They get a good draft capital come back from this trade. And the starting lineup, you get Scoot at the starting point guard. You don't have to worry about, if Dame stayed. Anthony Simons gets to play. Shadon Sharp looks really good. Then you get Jeremy Grant and DeAndre Ayton in the front court. That Blazers team looks like they're going to compete sooner than later. I mean, it's obviously a young squad. They're not going to be good right off the rip. But if they can develop Ayton into a really good center, I really like what Portland got out of this. I think I'm still waiting to see what comes with Holiday. If they keep him, then I think it could be a little bit awkward in the backcourt. But if they move on from him to get even more draft capital, maybe they send Holiday to a competitive team where he can start and make a playoff push like he was doing in Milwaukee these last couple of years. I think Portland did a really good job. So you mentioned the Suns. I want to ask another question about the Suns. Basically, we see them downgrade at the center position. They bring in a different type of guy with Nurkic, and they get some depth with guys like Grayson Allen and Nas Little. Do you think this was a necessary move for the Suns, or do you think their inclusion was a little bit too much?
I think if you're the Suns right now, especially getting rid of DeAndre Ayton, you come out of this and you feel happy because you already have your star players that you're building around. And the whole thing throughout this whole offseason for them is how do we get the best players that we can for the least amount of money because there's no money. They don't have any money right now. And with this trade overall, I mean, DeAndre Ayton was going to be gone. They've been trying to get rid of him and getting Nurkic, Grayson Allen, Nas Little, and Keon Johnson. I don't know how much Nas Little or Keon Johnson will play. I think with their depth chart, they probably will here. But overall, both of those guys, Grayson Allen will definitely be a big contributor from them coming off of the bench. We saw what he did with Milwaukee, and this is big for the Suns. I mean, they're like I said, they're trying to get as many good players as they can for not a lot of money, and it's a great trade for them. Overall, they're not giving up any draft picks in this trade, so they're getting rid of some guys and that were already basically out of the door in DeAndre Ayton. So I think the Suns come away and they feel happy in this trade. I think between all three of these teams, I don't really see necessarily a loser. I think there may be a team that benefited more, but I think overall, the way you look at it, the Bucks were trying to get Damian Lillard. They got their star player, and if that's all they get and they gave up that, I think they're fine with that because in the end, you still have Giannis and Damian Lillard and a top six that rivals pretty much any team to this point.
Yeah. And in the era of the three-team trade, obviously it's been around for a while, but we've seen it a lot more like post 2015. We've seen some three-team trades that get really lopsided. Even if only maybe one of the team loses, maybe two of the teams lose. I mean, there's trades that age really poorly, but just on paper, we don't know yet. None of these teams have played. This looks like one of the most well-rounded three-team trades to date. I mean, Milwaukee is really going to compete for a championship now. The Suns move on from a guy that they didn't really want in the locker room and they get more depth from it. And the Blazers get to jolt their rebuild and honestly get a better package back than they would have if they traded Dame anywhere else. I think this is a really fun trade. It's the last thing I expected to see today, but I think it's going to age. I expect really well for all of these teams. I'm excited to see what Portland does in a rebuild. We haven't seen Portland rebuild, it feels like ever. It's been a really long time now. So seeing them, fully flesh it out, seeing Scoot Henderson, the number 3 overall pick, get to work early as a starting point guard, I think Portland's going to be really fun. If I had to pick a winner, I think it would be them just because of my expectations. But if the Bucks win the chip, then it's a completely different story.
Yeah, and like you said before, I mean, this Blazers possible depth chart that we're looking at in the backcourt, you have guys like Scoot and Anthony. At the wings, you have Shaden Sharp and Matisse Thybulle, who can still be a good contributor for him. Jabari Walker, too. The forwards that we're looking at, Jeremy Grant, DeAndre Ayton. This team, like you said, can compete pretty soon as we're looking at it, especially after this trade. I mean, if we're going to make a comparison to an NFL team, it's really looking like the Texans at this point. They've built up the young players. They get a trade in here, they get a big draft pick, and they might be competing sooner than we think. I mean, this team, the beauty of having all these young players is maybe Anthony and Shaden Sharp both don't come out as superstars, but you don't need them to. You have guys like Scoot, and with all these young players, if some of them don't grow as much as you hope, but the other ones do, you have so many young talent that you're going to be able to get out of there. And there is one guy I didn't mention, Drew Holiday. I think the main thing right now in the league is that he will get traded. I just don't really see him staying there. The one team that I've seen pop up that has shown interest that I want to talk about is the Sixers here. And I think that, I mean, a homecoming for Drew Holiday. I wouldn't be surprised if Daryl Morey goes out there and does it. The main question I have for you, I guess, in this trade is how would this affect them possibly getting a guy like James Harden? Would this be a straight up trade, or do we see a third team come in? Because if the Sixers still want to get rid of James Harden, do the Blazers want James Harden? Do we see a third team come in and then make that happen? Because I do see James Harden leaving, and I think, I mean, out of all the teams going for Drew Holiday, I wouldn't be surprised if he wants to go back to Philadelphia.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I think Holiday back to Philadelphia would be a really good fit. And the money has to make sense at some point, though. If this is the way that a three-team trade for Harden goes down, I think I could definitely see that happening. The Blazers, in my opinion, that's the last thing you should do. You're good in the guards right now. You're young. You're rebuilding. Don't bring in James Harden because then you're basically just in the same situation of when you had Dame. Harden's worse than Dame. Don't get me wrong, but you don't need a guard that needs the ball all the time when you're trying to develop Scoot Henderson to be one of the best young guards in the league. For a three-team trade sense, though, I think Holiday and Harden are out at a little bit of different levels, but they get paid similarly. And I would argue that some teams, like the Sixers, would much rather have Holiday. I think that's a super interesting question. I think that's something we could see come sooner than later. As you mentioned, early October is when teams start doing their press releases. We start getting pictures of the guys in the uniforms. So with that in mind, I think Philly wants to move on from Harden as soon as possible if they can. There's a lot in the cards right now. There's a lot that could happen. But I think to answer your question in more of a grand scheme of things, I don't think the Drew Holiday trade is going to be something simple. I think Drew Holiday is going to be a piece in another big trade that the Blazers just hope to get even more picks from. So, I mean, on paper right now, they get 1 first rounder, 2 pick swaps. That might not make people super excited, but if they get a boatload of picks back in some fashion from trading Holiday, then I think that would be even better for Portland. I think they're in a really, really good spot.
Yeah, and I think overall too, just bringing this back around because Drew Holiday, we do expect to get traded, and depending on how this goes, the Clippers still seem like they're interested in James Harden. So if we see like a 3-team trade between these teams, I think with this domino going down, with Damian Lillard getting traded, James Harden goes to the front office. He talks to Daryl Morey. He's like, if they're going to do the trade, I got to get traded soon because I don't think he wants to be on this team. I mean, he's shown it, he's said it, especially after what Daryl Morey said. So, with the Sixers being interested, with the Clippers still being interested in James Harden, it's going to be interesting what we see, especially throughout the next few days, because with this happening, the Damian Lillard domino finally coming down, I wouldn't be surprised if we see James Harden get shipped off next. So, I mean, there's still a lot to come. We haven't even started the season yet. We're just about a month away at this point, and there's a lot of big things coming down. So we could see a James Harden trade soon. There's a lot of other guys that are always up in the air. We never know what we're going to see, but this could potentially open up the hole for a lot of other players to get traded now.
Yeah, absolutely. And to kind of transition us over, obviously Miami misses out on this deal. They don't get Dame, but in football, Miami's looking better than ever. Obviously, they're 3-0 right now. They just put up 70 points on the Broncos. And some people are saying they're the Super Bowl favorites. Not to mention, some people have Tua as their MVP favorite up to this point. How legit is this Dolphins team? And how legit is Tua? Are they your Super Bowl favorites? Is Tua winning the MVP? What do you think about the Dolphins right now?
Yeah, I think the same thing. We've talked about this a little bit before. Statistically, if you look at Tua from this year compared to last year, it's pretty similar. He had a very good start to last year. Obviously, the concussions came in, so hopefully that doesn't happen this year or any injuries. But if he can stay on this trajectory, this offense is built amazing. I mean, this offense is built the same way with Tyreek Hill and some fast receivers like Jalen Waddle and some fast running backs too. The same way that we saw the Chiefs built up at their peak with Tyreek Hill. When you have a guy like Tyreek Hill who it seems like people forget how good he is until the season starts again. And then he has these 250-yard games. And then, because people before the season, I mean, I saw people have Tyreek Hill as outside of the top 5 just because people get so excited about these young receivers. But he is one of the best receivers and guys just to get open that we've seen. So Tua, right now, the odds-on favorite for MVP. I would hold off a little bit because he's a guy that, like we've seen before, he's definitely susceptible to mistakes. We've seen he hasn't been a perfect player these first few weeks, though. He has looked good. So I think once we see what happens this week, especially against a tough Bills defense, that starts to get a little bit more of a tell. But as of right now, I would say the Dolphins definitely, with this offense, a top 3 chance to win. And I mean, as of right now, I still think that the Chiefs, I would still give them the edge just because of the experience, but the Dolphins team is definitely coming.
Yeah. I mean, if we're talking right now, I think the Dolphins should be the Super Bowl favorites. I don't see why not. They're 3-0, and as we've mentioned, Tua is playing incredible. Obviously, it's risky to say any team is going to win the Super Bowl after 3 games in the season. Doesn't matter how good they look, but they have to be my favorite. I always talk about their run defense. I really like it. It hasn't even played up to the standard I thought they would so far, but I think they have a lot of great things going on there. Jalen Phillips has looked great as an edge rusher, which is a guy that I don't want to say I forgot about, but a guy that hasn't really had a lot of buzz ever since he got drafted. But I remember, I mean, he was one of our favorite guys in the draft that year. He's a really good edge rusher. So seeing him play at a high level is super good for this Miami team. Obviously, Hill and Waddle is going to be one of the best wide receiver duos in the league. They both are so quick and find ways to get open. And a big story was with them was their running game. In our preseason predictions, I had low expectations for Miami because I didn't like their running game. And I've been proven wrong. Raheem Mostert in his older age looks really, really good. And I think the biggest takeaway from that Broncos game was Devon Achane. He looked amazing. And he's a guy that got a lot of buzz, especially in like fantasy scapes, because he was meant to get a lot of touches. And he got a lot of touches in that Denver game and got over 200 yards on the ground. I mean, that's just incredible. With that being said, right now, with how the Dolphins are playing and how the offense has looked, Tua would have to be the MVP favorite, in my opinion. I mean, last year we saw him play on a top tier level before the injuries. And even at the end of the year, he finished 9th in MVP voting, and he didn't even come close to playing a full season. Tua has the talent. I've been saying it. I'm a big Tua guy. I think he is a really solid quarterback in the NFL right now. And with the Dolphins offense looking so dynamic, being coached so well by Mike McDaniel, I think we're seeing Tua at his best possible situation. I really like the Dolphins. They're my Super Bowl favorites right now, but as you mentioned, this Bills matchup is going to be really huge. If they go out and beat the Bills and look good while doing it, I'll be even more confident. But this Bills team has a pretty good chance to knock some reality into Dolphins fans for sure.
Yeah, and I think the main thing, since this offense is so good and we've seen what they can do, is the defense. They've been good this year, but obviously there's still a few question marks with Jalen Ramsey being out too. We'll see how that happens this week against the Bills with a guy like Stephon Diggs, who just always seems like he's open on every play, probably the best route runner in the NFL. But without Jalen Ramsey, even if they can continue to play well defensively, I still think that if he comes back midway through the season and you're still up there and the defense has been playing well, then that obviously makes this team even harder to defend. But as of right now, I still got to stick with my Super Bowl prediction. But a few weeks in, they're looking very good. And I still have to give them a few weeks left to see what happens, just because we've seen so many teams play very well through the first few weeks. But if they can come out here and play against this Bills team who has struggled a little bit, so they should, if they can go and attack the weaknesses of the Bills and potentially pick them apart like we've saw the past few weeks against these other teams, then this offense will be good. But as of right now, I would say they're top three in the NFL right now, but I don't know if I can officially give them my nod for Super Bowl favorites.
Yeah, fair enough. And we're talking about the Dolphins, who might be one of the best teams in the NFL. But let's kick it to the other spectrum. Right now, there's 4 0-3 teams, being the Panthers, Bears, Broncos, and Vikings. I think we kind of eliminated the Panthers from this question. They have a rookie quarterback who is fighting injury right now. They're probably not going to turn it around this season. But out of the 3 teams being Chicago, Denver, and Minnesota, which one of those teams do you think is most likely to turn around and maybe fight for a playoff spot this year?
I mean, on paper, I think the answer does have to be the Vikings with how good this team is, with Justin Jefferson and how well Kirk Cousins has played despite the losses. But that defense is probably one of the worst, bottom 5 at least in the NFL right now. And it's been bad. We've seen the past few years, it's been bad. Last year, that's what happened in the playoffs. They were good. And the reason why they won so many games last year is because the offense went out there and got it done. They had almost 10 plus 1-score wins last year, which they ended up with a lot of victories. But in the end, if you want to be a dominant team, you don't want to win every single game by 1 score. And we saw what happened in the playoffs. It was another 1-score game, and the Giants got their defense. And they just haven't really addressed the defense as much as you'd hope if you were a Vikings fan. Going into this year, Jordan Addison is a great player, but if your defense is one of the worst in the NFL and you're drafting another receiver in the first round, what does that get you? I still think they're the best if we're looking at all these teams. Someone's going to get a win between them and the Panthers. I think the Panthers right now, the way this team is built with Bryce Young, I just don't really see them having that much of a chance to succeed this year. The Broncos have looked good. I mean, Russell Wilson, even though they're losing, has looked very good statistically. One of the best quarterbacks right now in the NFL, but it doesn't matter up at this point. The Bears are the worst team in the NFL. They have the worst quarterback in the NFL. I guess depending, you can put him in the same bin as Zach Wilson, which uh, you can compare that however you want. But these guys, the Bears have no chance to do anything. They're going to have 2 top 5 picks, so they can address that next year. But I think the Vikings, out of these 4 teams, I don't know if there's really another answer to give. I guess the Broncos could be up there, but I think this Vikings team does have a chance. But all 4 of these teams, the season, I would say, is pretty much over. I don't really see the Vikings getting to that point of making the playoffs.
Yeah. And I would also agree with the Vikings, but I had a feeling you would go that way. So I did want to make a case for the Broncos. I think they obviously suck right now. They've looked really bad. But as you mentioned, I think the narrative is shifting that Russell Wilson isn't the answer at QB. I think Russell Wilson's been good this year. Excuse me, much better than he has looked, especially in the last couple of years. Last year being in Denver, he looked really bad. Uh, he's not prime Russ, don't get me wrong, but he's good enough. And I think the Broncos definitely have a shot at turning things around at least a little bit. They have a pretty easy game coming up against the Bears. Oh, excuse me. As you mentioned, they should go out and beat that Bears team. Wow. Oh my God, I'm getting choked up talking about the Broncos. But Patrick Surtain hasn't really looked good so far, which is not what I expected. I expect him to pick up some of that magic he had his first year. And the defense in general, I don't like their pass rush. Their run defense is meh. but they have good linebackers, good safeties, good corners. They do things well in the pass defense, and they're throwing the ball well right now on offense. Their biggest problems are running and run defense. And those are tough problems to have in the NFL. Don't get me wrong. I don't really see this Broncos team as a playoff team, but those are also things that can be touched up. You change around where some guys are playing on the O-line. You try some other guys out at running back. These things can be touched up. I don't think the Broncos are going to be good. They obviously have to play the Chiefs twice more, the Chargers twice more. They lost to the Raiders the first time, which should have been a win for them. So they're in a tough spot. But with the Vikings defense being so bad and me seeing a little more flashes from the Broncos on both sides of the ball, I think they would also be a good answer. It's not the Panthers. It's not the Bears. I think the Broncos have a shot.
Yeah. And I could definitely see that. I mean, the defense itself has been good. A lot of good young talent, arguably one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL, too. And like you said, Russell Wilson has been playing very well this year, but no one really cares because last year he played bad and he went there. I don't think they have a very good head coach, if I'm being honest. Sean Payton had a lot of good Saints teams, and I think we're getting at the point where he probably shouldn't have come back. I don't know how good this team would have been. They couldn't be worse if he wasn't there at this point, if you look at it. But I definitely could see them coming out as the best team out of these four with Russell Wilson playing well. They have a bunch of good wide receivers, but this Vikings team being so dynamic on offense and being so awful on defense, I think they'll end up winning some games just because the fact is that Justin Jefferson can win you a game by himself. If he goes out there and gets 150 yards, Kirk Cousins has been throwing like 300 yards per game and a few touchdowns, but this defense is allowing like 50 points a game just because they look like a middle school defense. And the other two teams, like we mentioned, the Bears and the Panthers, don't really have a chance, but the Panthers have a chance to develop their quarterback this year. And as a rookie quarterback, too, he's in this class with three other guys that we've seen so far, potentially four, depending on if we see the debut of Aiden O'Connell. But we'll hold off on that, Raiders franchise fans. But I want to ask you, who do you think has been the most impressive rookie quarterback right now? And I know you're a big Anthony Richardson fan, so maybe stats aside too, who have you been impressed by?
Yeah, and I'm not going to answer this question statistically. I think I have a pretty good guess that you'll talk about CJ Stroud. And by the numbers, CJ Stroud is that guy, but I am a big Anthony Richardson guy, and he's been really impressive to me. I think we're starting to see now that dual threat quarterbacks have become way more common in the NFL. I think there's two different types of dual threat quarterbacks. I think there's ones that really can't throw the ball, and you could say a guy like Justin Fields would be in that category. And then there's guys that really throw and run equally as impressively. I think the first guy in that category would be Lamar, but based on what I've seen from Anthony Richardson, I think he would be in that category as well. He's got to figure out the injury things. That's obviously a problem, but I don't really worry about guys getting injured early if they don't have a long injury history. Anthony Richardson's a guy that's been healthy. So this is, a new thing for him to catch injuries like that. And I think he'll be okay once he gets used to the NFL game, start sliding more, all that good stuff. So in the limited action we've seen from him, he's been really, really good. I think people were incredibly worried about him being this boom or bust guy with a low floor, but I actually think he looks confident out there. He makes good reads. And when the play is busted, he's athletic enough to go get you 3 or 4 yards. I think a lot of the problems that people were telling me about Anthony Richardson are problems I see in Bryce Young instead. I like Anthony a lot. I think he's going to be really good. By the numbers, I think Stroud has the best argument. But by the end of the season, assuming Anthony Richardson is ready to go next week or the week after, I think we could look back on this year and maybe say that AR has the best argument for the best rookie QB in the class.
Yeah. And I think Anthony Richardson, like you said, going into this draft, we both liked him over a guy like Will Levis, who we haven't seen yet, just because we knew that he might struggle to start off and he would get it done, though, at some point. But we haven't really seen that. He's been out a little bit with a concussion, but he should be coming back fine to play the rest of this season. But like you said before, one guy that I do want to talk about is CJ Stroud. Going into this season, going into this draft, the main talk, CJ Stroud, like we talked about for a few weeks, was basically the lock for the number 1 overall pick when the Panthers traded. A lot of us thought that that was their guy. Obviously, we didn't really know officially up until the draft who would go 1. And I don't think Bryce Young is a bust at this point. You can't really say that 3 weeks in. I think he'll figure it out with that offense. But CJ Stroud has impressed me a lot, especially with what we've seen from Ohio State quarterbacks so far. They just haven't really panned out in the past few years, especially the past few years that we've seen. But this guy has great accuracy. I mean, he's throwing for at least 250 yards per week. He's up there with some of the best stats from quarterbacks across the NFL right now. And he's doing this with a team that before this season, we both didn't really predict them to do well just because even if he did well himself, CJ Stroud, this team wasn't really built that well. But they've got guys that have gone out there like Tank Dell who have been great for this offense. They knocked off the Jags last week. And last week we talked about it. They might be closer to competing than all of us really think at this point. And if he can continue this, I mean, the ceiling is the roof for this team. Maybe not this year, but if they can continue to build up and CJ Stroud plays well this year, he's the favorite right now, right behind Bijan Robinson for rookie of the year. So if he can continue to having a great year like this, even if the Texans can win a few games, they're going to be able to get a guy in the draft. There's a lot of great receivers that we've talked about. You throw a guy like Xavier Worthy on this team with CJ Stroud, and that offense gets way more dynamic next year. There's a lot of good receivers in this draft. So he's impressed me the most if we're talking about just our expectations going into this season. And the Texans team overall has impressed me a lot.
Yeah, I completely agree. A fun comparison that I've been kind of thinking about watching CJ Stroud play is Matthew Stafford. Matthew Stafford has this really good ability, and he's played with some great receivers, don't get me wrong, but he can make anyone look good. We've seen it this year already with Puka Nacua, Tutu Atwell. Guys that aren't really top tier receivers look great because Matt Stafford's putting them in good positions. And I'm incredibly encouraged with seeing how good Tank Dell has been. Tank Dell was a guy that was pretty low on some people's draft boards because at Houston, he was more of a gadget player. People didn't really believe he would be a good NFL receiver. And him and Stroud have just looked like they're firing on all cylinders. I know guys like Nico Collins will step up. I know Dalton Schultz is all right. I expect these guys to perform. But seeing Stroud and Dell work together, really encouraging. I think Stroud is going to be really good. He's looked really good. And as you mentioned, the Texans get him more options to work with. This offense is going to be, top 10 in the league pretty soon.
Yeah, and this team overall, the main reason why a lot of these college quarterbacks just don't succeed in the NFL, like we've said before, if you're at Alabama or you're at Ohio State, you have the best receivers in the country. And at the end of the day, if a quarterback has really good receivers, then that can make the quarterback look good. And we've seen that with a bunch of these cases so far. And CJ Stroud could have been another guy. As of right now, he's playing well. We don't know, but talking about right now, he's played well. And a guy last year who had Emeka Egbuka, Marvin Harrison on his roster. Both of those guys, some of the best wide receivers in the country right now. But he's coming out here with guys, like you said, like Tank Dell. Dalton Schultz is a decent tight end. And a lot of these guys in the wide receiver room that got signed off of other teams' practice squads before this year. This team was really gutted going into the season, but he's been able to make it work. And he's looked like the best rookie quarterback. And he's been playing like a top 15 quarterback with his accuracy right now.
Oh, absolutely. One thing I want to say and want to mention, and I kind of wish we could talk about him more. I do think Bryce Young is going to be a really good quarterback. I stand on that. He just has, similar to CJ Stroud, not a lot of options. And I think his offensive line is marginally a lot worse, to be honest. I know marginally and a lot are antonyms, but it's just worse. I mean, I think Bryce Young needs to stay healthy, similar to Anthony Richardson. Bryce is obviously the opposite of Anthony. He's a much smaller guy. He's got to learn how to avoid sacks a little bit better at the NFL level. Even his dropbacks, he's a very relaxed passer, but he needs to have some urgency on his dropbacks sometimes. Obviously, these are just notes. He was the number one pick for a reason. I think Bryce Young, towards the end of the season, will also be in this conversation. Just even opposed to a guy like Anthony Richardson, who's been hurt, I really haven't seen anything from Bryce Young yet. I think it's going to be really solid. Will Levis, neither of our favorite guy, but assuming he gets some playing time in Tennessee this year, I think he could go out and look pretty solid as a rookie. He's definitely a day one ready guy, in my opinion. So there's a lot of guys that will be in this conversation. Right now, it's got to be Stroud. But I do want to touch on some of these other guys where when we bring up this topic, week 15, week 16, I think we could be having a completely different conversation.
Yeah, and like you said, Bryce Young too. I think he'll be a good quarterback. His wide receiver room right now with Adam Thielen, DJ Chark, Terrace Marshall, Laviska Shenault, a bunch of guys that are good, but you just got to figure out how to work with this offense. I'm not really sure how I feel overall with the coaching and everything that's gone on. I think it may take him a little bit of time to figure out this offense. And obviously, it's very different from playing at Alabama with all those high level receivers. He's playing in an offense now with guys like Terrace Marshall and Laviska Shenault, who are a lot more like gadget guys. And I think, honestly, I wouldn't blame their losses on him. I think they just haven't been able to figure it out. I know both of us big Laviska Shenault fans, and he's one of those guys. I've gone on the record before. I've said he could be maybe not as good as Deebo Samuel, but he's one of those guys that has the same exact skill set, and he just hasn't seen it used yet. I was hoping that potentially that could happen in Jacksonville this year, but I think the coaching with the Panthers right now, I just don't really think Frank Wright is that good of a head coach as we saw in Indianapolis. I mean, they had a new quarterback every year. So he could figure it out, and this team could figure it out. And I think once we get towards the end of the season, Bryce Young could definitely be in the argument. But as of right now, it's hard not to go with CJ Stroud.
Yeah, I completely agree. Nothing to add to that.
Yeah. And with that being said, this episode, I know we talked about the Bucks a lot. Obviously, this Giannis and Dame combo is going to be massive for us. And by the time we get on next week, we may even see another big trade go down by then. With the NBA season starting up soon, starting next week, we'll start with our predictions for the season, kind of start rolling those in as we're a month away. I know a lot of the fans here on the channel are big NBA fans. A lot of our videos in the NBA do very well. So we'll definitely start talking about that more once the season starts to go. And with the NFL, a lot to talk about there too. So we'll see what happens. Hopefully we have another big trade to talk about by next week.
Yeah, we're getting to the best part of sports season. We'll have basketball, we'll have football, we'll have it all. Hey, we have hockey, and we'll see if Cam can get on here to help us out with that. But really excited, tons of new content coming. You guys are still supporting the channel super well. Me and Banning both appreciate that, tenfold. It's awesome. So we're happy to be here for you guys, and we got all the sports news you need.
Yeah. And with that being said, we'll see you in the next one.
See you guys.